In 1871, shortly after dropping out of college, a 21-year-old Henry Clay Frick began work on what would become one of the most lucrative businesses the world had ever seen. Having noticed the potential for Pittsburgh's growing steel industry, Frick and his two cousins officially incorporated the Frick Coke Company. Their plan? To control the supply of superheated, carbon-rich coal needed to make steel. When Frick first needed the money to open his coke ovens, he took out a $75,000 loan using his mother's estate as collateral, about $2.5 million in today's money. And with this cash in hand, Frick set to work constructing beehive ovens just a stone's throw away from his home in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. Frick's mission to build ovens, however, would turn out to be much more expensive than he had planned, especially as the economy continued to worsen throughout the 1870s. With funds tightening all across the nation, it wasn't long before Frick exhausted his money. With few places to turn, Frick sought an additional $10,000 loan from the Honorable Thomas Mellon. Though he had few assets to leverage, Frick was able to convince the judge to loan him the money based on little more than Frick's charm and ambition to control the coke industry. With the new financial lifeline from Judge Mellon, Frick set back to work constructing coke ovens. And the judge's loan, it would seem, couldn't have come at a better time, because the economy continued to worsen as a lot of America's elites began to invest their capital overseas. With cash becoming scarcer by the day, Frick's cousins and all of the company's investors sold their shares back to Frick. He was now the sole executive of his coke company, an autocrat of his private empire. By 1878, Frick had opened thousands upon thousands of coke ovens, each producing around 9 tons of coke every single day. Not even a decade after dropping out of school, Frick found himself a millionaire, with a net worth of over $32 billion in today's money. Whether it was out of gratitude or a genuine bond, Frick continued to deepen his connection with the Mellon family over the coming years, eventually closely befriending the judge's son, Andrew Mellon. In 1881, Andrew introduced Frick to the woman that the coke mogul would soon marry, Adelaide Childs. After being wed shortly after their introduction, the young couple honeymooned to the glitz and glamour of New York City, where the Mellons introduced the Fricks to a man that would soon change everything. Celebrated industrialist and philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie, and indeed his Scottish mother, hit it off with the Fricks right away, and offered to host them a banquet while they were in New York. Now, at this feast, the men dined and got to know each other before the conversation started to drift towards business. Carnegie informed Frick that even though the Scotsman steel empire was producing an extraordinary amount of metals at all of its different sites, they were only producing coke at one of them, the Edgar Thomson Works. As the men got to know a little bit about each other's businesses, the idea of a vertical integration was proposed. If the two companies were to merge, the men argued, Frick would always have a customer in Carnegie, and Carnegie would always have a low-cost supplier in Frick. After some more rounds of food and drinks, Frick sold the controlling shares of his coke company to Carnegie. As Frick was brought into Carnegie's steel enterprise, he was given more and more administrative tasks at the companies. Frick, with his experience running a company single-handedly, was an extremely aggressive businessman. Always keeping an eye out for investment opportunities, Frick was keen to purchase up real estate for Carnegie, and he actually acquired several acres for him and his companies. With the help of Frick, not only did Carnegie's company vertically integrate, it horizontally integrated with a lot of failing competition in and around the Pittsburgh area. Frick wasn't just a capitalist, he was a monopolist. His approach to business was simple: corner the market, cannibalize the market, and then dictate the market. Though Frick's tactics brought Carnegie a lot of money, the differing approaches to running a business was actually a point of contention in the otherwise amicable relationship between the two men. Carnegie was famously pro-labor and pro-union, whereas Frick, when he was running his own company, was not. He was notorious for breaking up strikes and busting unions whenever he could. He saw them as an impediment to the private industry. These differing perspectives between Frick and Carnegie eventually drove Frick to take a hiatus from the company to spend time in Europe. Almost immediately after his departure, however, Frick's indispensability quickly became apparent both to Carnegie and to his longtime business partner, Henry Phipps. Frick was brought back to the States, where he continued using Carnegie's profits to purchase up failing competition in and around Pittsburgh. As Carnegie started receiving the deeds to his new factories, Frick proposed an interesting idea. Why doesn't Carnegie consolidate Frick's Coke Company and all of Carnegie's steel companies into one umbrella organization, the Carnegie Steel Company? Carnegie decided that this was a great idea, and Frick was given the responsibility of overseeing the merger. As Frick was navigating this merger, one of the new factories to be brought under the Carnegie umbrella was the Homestead Steel Works, just a few miles upstream from downtown Pittsburgh. Along with the deed to the mill, Carnegie and his company inherited with it a workers' union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. As the company examined their options for what to do with this newly acquired site, it was decided that the Homestead Works would undergo heavy renovations to modernize the plant with new machinery and automation. This plan, it was decided, would both increase the output of steel and decrease the cost of labor at the mill. Many locals, however, having spent their whole lives working in the mill before it had even been acquired by Frick and Carnegie, were understandably concerned about this industrial automation coming for their jobs. As the mill was being renovated, the employees struck a number of times, often being led by the Amalgamated Association Union. Constant strikes at the newly modernized Homestead Works led to the state-of-the-art factory producing less average tonnage than competing mills which had not been automated at all. With the Homestead Works losing a lot of money, both the philanthropical Carnegie and the union-busting Frick declared the union to be a corrupt nuisance to their enterprise, especially because it only represented 1 in 5 workers at the factory. With the company's current contract with the union set to expire in June of 1892, Frick entered negotiations with their representatives that spring. The union asked Frick for a slight wage increase, about which he pondered for a moment before retorting with a 22% wage decrease. He told the Amalgamated Association, "The firm has decided that the minority must give way to the majority. These works, therefore, will be necessarily non-union after the expiration of our present agreement." On the 30th of April, Frick informed the union that 29 days remained for negotiations, and if no agreement could be reached within that time frame, the Carnegie Company would cease to recognize the union altogether. After discussing with Carnegie, Frick offered the unionized workers a slightly improved wage scale before informing them, "We do not care whether a man belongs to a union or not, nor do we wish to interfere. He may belong to as many unions or organizations as he chooses, but we think our employees at Homestead Works would fare much better working under the system in vogue at Edgar Thomson and Duquesne." With the days ticking by and no agreement being reached, Frick locked the workers out of the plate mill on the evening of June 28th, 1 day before the deadline. The following morning, Frick locked the workers out of the rest of the complex. A high, barbed wire fence was erected around the perimeter of the property, and sniper towers with searchlights were constructed adjacent to every entrance. Water cannons, steel armor, and other fortifications began to surround the mill as well. With these militaristic renovations to the factory, locals dubbed the newly fortified mill Fort Frick. On June 30th, the union announced that Carnegie Steel Company, in locking the plant a day early, had broken their contract with the workers. The workers remaining in Fort Frick, not even associated with the union, but upset with the company's management, struck in solidarity. As word spread about the situation at Homestead, workers from nearby mills all across the Pittsburgh region, some tens of thousands of workers, joined the collective strike in sympathy. The employees of the mill of Carnegie, Phipps and Company at Homestead, PA have built there a town with its homes, its school and its churches, and have for many years been faithful co-workers with the company in the business of the mill, have invested thousands of their savings in said mill in the expectation of spending their lives in Homestead. Therefore, the committee desires to express to the public its firm belief that both the public and the employees aforesaid have equitable rights and interests in said mill, which cannot be modified or diverted without due process of law. It is our duty as American citizens to resist by every legal and ordinary means the unconstitutional, anarchic, and revolutionary policy of the Carnegie Company, which seems to show a contempt for public and private interests and a disdain for the public conscience. The striking workers wanted to do everything in their power to keep the plant closed and prevent the manufacturing of steel products. Many of the strikers were able to procure a steam-powered launch boat and several rowboats to patrol the waters of the Monongahela River where barges would dock at the steel mill. Striking men in the town of Homestead divided themselves into military units, and 24-hour shifts were established to maintain a constant line of sight on the mill property. Incoming ferries and trains were watched with an acute paranoia, and visitors to town were questioned about their business. If they couldn't provide a satisfactory answer, townspeople would escort the visitors out. Reporters for the press were given special badges which allowed them to move freely and safely throughout the militarized zone. But if any locals believed a reporter had lied about their credentials or was writing a false narrative about the story, the badge would be revoked, and they too would be escorted out of town. Neighbors in Homestead were asked to remain orderly, and tavern owners were asked to prevent excessive drinking and to maintain the peace. On July 5th, Sheriff William McCleary was sent by Frick to the Homestead Works in order to tell the strikers to cease their disruption at once. This, of course, did not sit right with the striking workers, who corralled the sheriff and his deputies onto a boat and sent him downriver to Pittsburgh. Frick's intention was to reopen the plant to non-union labor by the 6th of July, but with the strikes still persisting, Frick contracted the Pinkerton Private Security Agency to defend the Homestead Works. At around 10:30 p.m. on July 5th, some 300 Pinkerton agents assembled about 5 miles downstream of Pittsburgh. The Pinkertons, many of whom were hired through a temp agency, were completely unaware of what their assignment was, but they were given Winchester rifles and badges that read, "Watchman, Carnegie Company Limited." The steel workers, however, were well aware of what the Pinkertons had in store, as they had been notified of the Pinkertons' departure from Boston. When it was confirmed that the agents had indeed made it to Pittsburgh, a small flotilla of Union boats sailed downriver to go and meet the Pinkertons. Strikers on the steamboat fired a few warning shots at the Pinkertons before quickly retreating back to the plant to warn the others. At 2:30 in the morning on July 6, the striking workers blew the factory's steam whistle, alerting the town to take action. Within minutes, thousands of men, women, and children were drawn from their homes and towards Fort Frick. After waiting for about an hour and a half, the Pinkertons attempted to disembark in the 4 a.m. darkness, when shots began to ring out in the Monongahela Valley. Conflicting testimony exists as to who took the first shot in Homestead, with the New York Times reporting that it was the Pinkertons, and some witnesses claiming that it was one of the strikers. Regardless of who took the first shot, the first wounded individuals were William Foy, a steel worker, and Friedrich Hinde, captain of the Pinkerton agents. After the first shots rang out, the Pinkertons immediately fired into the crowd of workers, killing 2 and wounding 11. The strikers responded in kind, killing 2 and wounding 12 Pinkertons. Over the next several minutes, shots continued to ring out from both sides. The Pinkertons began to cut holes in the iron barges in order to make embrasures to shoot out of. The striking workers, meanwhile, huddled behind the mill scrap iron for protective cover. It was around this time that the Pinkertons' flagship tugboat returned to the embarkation point with their wounded men, leaving the rest of their agents stranded at the mill. With this in mind, the striking workers set up ramparts out of scrap iron and positioned themselves upstream and above the Pinkerton barges. Hundreds of local wives, daughters, mothers, and sisters began to congregate mid-field between the Pinkertons and their striking loved ones. The growing crowd of women began chanting in unison, "Kill the Pinkertons!" as the steelworkers took the occasional pot shot at the iron barges from their new vantage points. Other steelworkers took rowboats out to the Mon, from which they were able to make a few shots against the Pinkertons still stuck at the riverbank. By 6 a.m., John McLucky, who was the Burgess of Homestead, issued a proclamation asking for the people of the borough to come and help defend the peace. Within a short while, more than 5,000 people were congregated on the streets of Homestead, overlooking the scene at Fort Frick from the hills. Across the Monongahela, near Duck Hollow, a 20-pound cannon was set up facing the stranded Pinkerton barges. Attempts were made to hit the agents, but all of the attempts were unsuccessful in crossing such a wide river. 6 miles away in the town squares of Pittsburgh, thousands of factory workers and thousands just sympathetic to the strike listened on as the events were unfolding. As the firefight in Homestead continued into the daylight hours, many locals began to arm themselves and make haste towards Fort Frick. As the sun began to rise, a Pinkerton tugboat was once again spotted making its way upriver. By 8 a.m., they attempted to land once more. Seeing the Pinkerton tug approach, a striker took a shot from far up the riverbank. In retaliation, the Pinkertons killed 3 more strikers, and a 4th was killed when a cannon finally made it across the river, only to miss its intended target. By this point, with fully constructed fortifications and cannon fire, Homestead was a full war zone. Many Pinkerton agents, not fully knowing what they had signed up for, began abandoning ship and fleeing the scene. In fact, even some of the more veteran agents were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Behind the scenes, the actual Amalgamated Iron and Steelworkers Union was working tirelessly to defuse the situation. The president of the union asked Sheriff McCleary to arrange for a meeting with Frick in the hopes of reaching some kind of negotiation. Frick, however, refused to meet with the union. Knowing that a violent standoff could lead to the arrival of the state guard, Frick preferred to just sit back and let the situation continue to escalate. Local officials for the next hour resisted all temptation to call upon the Pennsylvania Guard. Eventually, however, at 10 a.m., Sheriff McCleary gave in and sent a telegram to the governor. In his transmission, the sheriff informed Governor Pattinson that the number of resisting locals had now grown past 5,000, and the sheriff's deputies had lost complete control of the situation. Sporadic gunfire continued between the two parties for some time, until just before 11 a.m., when the Pinkerton tugboat was once again spotted attempting to rescue the stranded officers. Within moments, however, a barrage of fire from over 300 local snipers and riflemen quickly drove the vessel away. The gunfight continued for yet another hour before another Pinkerton agent was sniped from above. The Pinkerton agent killed in action was A.L. Wells, who was a medical student who had picked up the job during the summer just to make a little bit of extra money while he was at school. By most accounts, he spent the gunfight attending to the wounded agents and was a big factor in the positive morale, or what remained of it, of the Pinkertons. With the continued gunfire and casualties, Sheriff McCleary once again made a transmission to the governor at around noon to update him on the situation. With no signs of the violence ending anytime soon, the strikers began to brainstorm a larger attack on the remaining Pinkertons. Many of the strikers who had not taken up sniper positions began to fill a small raft with oil-soaked lumber. Their plan was to set the raft ablaze and send it downstream directly towards the stranded Pinkerton barges. Many of the inexperienced Pinkerton agents, having seen this improvised pyrotechnic, began to panic, and in an effort to calm their nerves, a senior Pinkerton agent threatened to shoot dead any agent who abandoned ship. His instincts proved correct, as the homemade bomb burned itself out before reaching the Pinkertons. Strikers then noticed that the Pinkerton barges, having docked right at the mill's wharf, were directly adjacent to the railroad tracks. A train car carrying oil drums was also set ablaze and hurled down the tracks towards the Pinkertons, but it too flamed out before reaching its target. With their minds now set on large-scale destruction, the striking workers began throwing sticks of dynamite at the barges, with one of them hitting the target. The explosion, however, only caused a small amount of damage to the thick iron barge. After several hours of trying to finish off the Pinkertons, the strikers began dumping the remaining barrels of oil into the Monongahela River and attempted to just light the oil slick on fire. That attempt, much like the last few, was unsuccessful. By 3 p.m., a third telegram was sent from the sheriff to the governor, with the governor telling the sheriff that the state was not willing to get involved at this time. By 4 o'clock, William Way, the president of the union, was more than eager for the violence to end. He called for the strikers to let the Pinkertons surrender, but his calls went unanswered. Striking workers continued to fire their weapons at the stranded barges, and some began launching fireworks that were left over from the 4th of July. During a break in the action, Hugh O'Donnell, the head of the strike committee, addressed the crowd. Initially bloodthirsty after the day of violence, O'Donnell called for the Pinkerton agents to all be charged with murder. It quickly became apparent, however, that no real apparatus existed at that time for arresting over 300 armed militiamen, and this ask by the workers' union was unreasonable. After some consideration, it was decided that the Pinkertons would not be charged with murder, but rather just be escorted safely out of town and shielded from mob violence in an attempt to just get the whole thing over with. O'Donnell writes in his journal, "When I waved my handkerchief, one of the guards came out of the barges and waved his hands. As soon as he appeared, one of our men jumped from behind his barricade and exposed himself to the line of fire. I walked down the bank and I said to the man who had come out of the barge that I thought the whole thing had gone far enough, and he said that he thought it had gone altogether too far. He then accepted my proposition that his men should make an unconditional surrender and give up their rifles." The striking workers and those sympathetic to their case stripped the Pinkertons of their rifles and marched them through the crowd of thousands. Many, including mothers and children, were throwing rocks and coal at the Pinkertons, some going so far as to spit on them or even beat them out of consciousness. As the men were paraded through Homestead, the Pinkertons' barges were ransacked and, finally, after many failed attempts, were burned. The remaining uninjured Pinkerton agents were escorted to the town opera house, which had been set up as a makeshift detention center during the upheaval. Still in a frenzy from a day of bloodshed, many of the locals continued to assault and beat their prisoners once the Pinkertons were detained, which was a notable turning point in the public's perception of the strike. Throughout the evening, as the smoke settled on the battlefield, the Union began talks with the sheriff to initiate the transfer of the Pinkertons out of the Opera House. Just after 10 p.m., it was confirmed that a special train was en route to Pittsburgh, carrying both Pinkerton and Union representatives. When the train arrived just after midnight on the 7th, the men were informed that, per the agreement made with the strikers, the Pinkertons could not be charged with murder and were free to return from whence they came. As the sun came up the next morning, a train came to Pittsburgh and swiftly whisked the Pinkertons back to Boston. When all was said and done, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons died in the battle. The public, very supportive of labor strikes and workers' rights, was initially in overwhelming support of the Homestead workers. But after word had gotten out about the immense mob violence in Homestead, public opinion eventually began to favor the Pinkerton agents. Many of them were young college students and apprentices who had been assigned this task through a temp agency with absolutely no idea of the sheer brutality that awaited them. With public support for the Union waning, Frick finally enlisted the help of the Pennsylvania Guard, which deployed 3,500 agents to the Homestead Works to restore and maintain the peace. Shortly thereafter, Frick announced, "Under no circumstances will we have any further dealing with the Amalgamated Association as an organization. This is final."